A millionaire believed his pregnant wife died in a fiery crash, until she appeared months later at his mistress's baby shower. What followed was a shocking unraveling of lies, a hidden child, and a conspiracy that could bring down powerful men. Love, betrayal, and redemption collide in a story that proves some disappearances are not what they seem. Where are you watching from? Drop your city below, and don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable true-to-life stories like this one. I still remember the last morning I kissed her. It was a Thursday in early spring, the kind of morning where the air felt crisp and full of promise. Eleanor stood by the kitchen window in a pale blue blouse that made her eyes even more radiant, gently cradling her growing belly while sipping her usual chamomile tea. She always claimed it helped with the nausea, though I suspected she just liked the quiet ritual of it. She smiled at me that morning, not just a casual smile, but one of those intimate, knowing glances that carried 1,000 unsaid words. We had been together for years, but that smile still made my heart pause. She tucked a stray strand of chestnut hair behind her ear and whispered, "Don't forget to breathe today, Richard." She knew how consumed I'd become by work. Even as my wife carried our unborn son, I was darting between board meetings, client calls, and crisis control like the world would collapse if I paused for a moment. That morning, I promised her I'd slow down. I promised I'd call after the meeting. I promised we'd take a weekend off. I promised too many things, and I kept none of them. By noon, she was gone. I got the call from my assistant, Neil. His voice cracked in a way I'd never heard before. "There's been an accident," he said. "Eleanor's car?" It was on the Hudson Parkway. Pile up. Fire. At first, I didn't understand. My brain refused to connect the words. It felt abstract, like news happening to someone else. Then the line went silent for a beat too long, and I felt the ground fall away beneath me. The next few hours were a blur of frantic phone calls, unanswered questions, and an icy dread creeping into my bones. I called every hospital within 2 hours of Manhattan. No one had her. The police finally connected with me in the early evening. They spoke in clinical terms, words like fatal impact and no survivors, before pausing, softening, and telling me they had found her car, her ID, her purse. The vehicle had been consumed in flames. The body was unrecognizable. They'd confirmed her death based on the items found in the front seat. I didn't want to believe it. I begged for clarity. I demanded to see her, but they told me there was nothing left to see. I was 40 feet underground emotionally before the funeral even came. We held it a week later, a closed casket service filled with carefully rehearsed eulogies, marble flowers, and strangers offering hollow condolences. Eleanor had always hated pomp, and yet there I was, entombing her legacy beneath a mountain of white roses and polite pity. My mother, elderly and solemn, placed a hand on my shoulder as they lowered the casket. She whispered, "She would have wanted you to keep going, Richard." But how could I? My wife was gone. My son was gone. I had no heir, no direction, no meaning. The estate became a mausoleum overnight. I couldn't walk down the hallway without seeing her. Her paintings, her scarf still draped over the back of the armchair, the nursery untouched and full of pastel furniture we'd handpicked together. Her voice haunted me in echoes. I found myself lingering outside the nursery door, hand trembling on the knob but never entering. I'd stand there for hours, unable to open the door, unable to walk away. At night, I drank. And when the whiskey dulled the edges just enough, I replayed that last morning over and over again. The way she'd kissed my cheek, the way she'd told me to breathe. God, I would have traded every cent of my fortune to go back to that moment and stay in that kitchen with her. Neil, ever loyal, tried to intervene. "You need rest," he'd say. "Let me take care of the meetings. Let me cover things." But there was no business to care about anymore. I had built a financial empire on precision, discipline, and foresight, and in a single moment, all that clarity disintegrated into ash. Without Eleanor, I was just a man pretending to function. Gerald, my longtime attorney and friend, convinced me to step away from the company temporarily. "Grieve, Richard," he urged. "You've earned the right to be broken." And so I disappeared. I canceled appearances, unplugged my phone, and locked myself in my study. I lost track of the days. Sometimes I'd wake up at 3 a.m., sweating, convinced I'd heard her call my name from the hallway. Other times I'd stare at old photographs until the tears blurred them into obscurity. I even listened to her old voicemails, just to hear her say, "Hi, love," again. But no matter how much I mourned, nothing filled the void. I couldn't understand how a woman so full of life could vanish so completely. Eleanor had been my anchor, strong, graceful, and fiercely compassionate. She'd grown up with privilege, but had used it to serve others, volunteering at shelters, fighting for education reform, championing causes that made the world just a bit more bearable. She wasn't just admired, she was loved, deeply and universally. And she had loved me, despite my flaws, despite my obsession with work, despite my absence during so many important moments. Her loss hollowed me. The press, of course, had a field day. Tragedy at the top. Millionaire's pregnant wife perishes in fiery crash. The tabloids speculated wildly. Some even had the audacity to suggest foul play. But none of that mattered. The truth, as far as I knew, was simple. My wife was dead, and so was our son. It would be months before I realized how wrong I was. But in those early days, all I had was silence, sorrow, and 1,000 memories that refused to fade. I was no longer Richard Langston, financial titan. I was just a man who had lost everything that made his life worth living. And if I had known what was coming next, if I had even the faintest idea that the grave I stood beside didn't hold the woman I loved, I might have prepared myself differently. But I didn't. And the day I saw her again, the day Eleanor returned, that was the day everything I thought I knew turned to smoke. Grief has a strange way of turning time into something elastic, stretching moments of sorrow into lifetimes and snapping weeks into single blurred blinks. After the funeral, I found myself floating through days like a man watching his life from the outside, unable to touch anything real. I stopped returning calls, missed meetings, and let the empire I built quietly run on autopilot. My housekeepers tiptoed through the halls like mourners, dusting around objects they feared moving, as if disturbing Eleanor's memory might summon her ghost. Neil was the only one brave, or foolish, enough to try and drag me back to the surface. He brought me food, forwarded documents I didn't read, even tried coaxing me out for walks, but I didn't want the world. I wanted her. I didn't even know who I was without her laughter echoing through the halls or the scent of her orange blossom perfume lingering on my pillows. I was half a man, maybe even less. Then Sabrina Cole appeared. At first, she was just another name on a memo, someone from a subsidiary company, recently brought on as a financial strategist. I remembered noticing her once at a quarterly meeting, sitting quietly in the back, her sharp eyes sweeping the room like she was studying everyone's weaknesses. There was something striking about her, confident, self-contained, with a kind of polished beauty that didn't scream for attention but quietly demanded it. A few weeks after Eleanor's funeral, Neil arranged a lunch at the office under the guise of catching me up on operations. I was about to cancel, but something in me stirred, maybe guilt, maybe boredom, maybe some desperate instinct, trying to claw back a sense of control. I showed up late, unshaven and hollow-eyed. Sabrina was already there. She didn't say anything at first, just offered a calm smile as I slumped into the chair across from her. Then, after Neil excused himself, she pushed a plate toward me and said, "Eat. You look like hell." It was the first honest thing anyone had said to me in weeks. I smirked in spite of myself. "Is that how you plan to climb the ladder? Telling your boss he looks like he crawled out of a grave?" She tilted her head. "I figured someone needed to remind you that you're still alive." We talked for over 2 hours that day, mostly about work, market trends, missed opportunities, the numbers I was too numb to care about. But there was something else in her tone, an undercurrent of understanding, as though she knew what it meant to fall apart and stitch yourself back together in the dark. The lunches became more frequent, then dinners. Sometimes she brought files, sometimes just wine. She never pushed, never pried. She listened. And I, God help me, I started to talk. About Eleanor. About the way the light hit her face in the mornings. About the nursery we'd planned. About the guilt that wrapped around my throat like a noose. Sabrina never flinched. She just let me unravel, thread by bitter thread. I told myself it was harmless, a distraction, companionship. But one evening, as we stood on my back terrace overlooking the stillness of the Hudson, I looked at her and felt the terrifying flicker of need. Not the kind born of passion, but of survival. She reached for my hand and I didn't pull away. I'm not trying to replace her, she whispered. I know, I replied, though part of me wondered if I was trying to replace myself. That night, I let her stay. What followed wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was quiet, shadowed by grief, and laced with confusion. We didn't make grand declarations. We didn't speak of the future. It was like trying to build a house on the ruins of a collapsed cathedral. There was no foundation, only fragments. And yet, I kept letting her in. There were moments when her presence soothed the ache. The warmth of her voice in the mornings, the way she touched my shoulder in passing, the smell of fresh coffee when she arrived unannounced. She was careful not to overstep, but she was always near. Sometimes, too near. 6 months after Eleanor's funeral, Sabrina sat across from me at breakfast and slid a small white envelope onto the table. I stared at it, not understanding. It's not a resignation letter, she said gently. It's a pregnancy test. The room tilted. I blinked at her, the words swimming in slow motion. You're? She nodded, and for the first time she looked unsure of herself. I found out yesterday. I wanted to tell you first. I stood, walked to the window, and braced my hand against the glass. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. A baby. Another baby. Was it a gift? A curse? A second chance, or a cruel reminder? I turned to face her. Are you certain? About the test? She asked. Yes. About how you feel? That's less clear. I didn't answer. In the days that followed, I felt like I was drowning again. But this time, the water was different. It wasn't sorrow. It was fear. Guilt. Confusion. A baby meant permanence. It meant ties I wasn't ready to acknowledge. It meant facing the fact that Eleanor's child, the one we lost, was not coming back. But this one was. Sabrina never pushed. She simply began rearranging her life, subtly and gracefully, as if she already knew she would be doing it alone. She moved into an apartment nearby, still visited often, but never assumed space in my house that hadn't been offered. And slowly, the news settled. I found myself placing my hand on her belly, absent-mindedly, imagining what might come next. I even dared to hope. We never made a public announcement. I wasn't ready, and she understood. But those closest to us, Neil, Gerald, a few members of the board, began to suspect. Whispers stirred at charity dinners and corporate events. People said I had moved on too fast. Some called her opportunistic. Others said I was clinging to any lifeline I could find. Maybe they were all right. But I wasn't thinking about the headlines. I was thinking about redemption, about legacy, about the chance to be a father again, to get it right this time. Then came the baby shower. Sabrina wanted something elegant but understated, just a gathering on the estate lawn with pastel ribbons and catered hors d'oeuvres. She invited a carefully curated list of guests, mostly from our business circles, a few old friends and her family who flew in from Miami. The weather was perfect. The sky blue and cloudless. The garden awash in hydrangeas and jasmine. I wore a linen blazer I hadn't touched in months, shook hands, smiled for photos, played the part of the supportive father-to-be. And for a moment, just one brief golden moment, I let myself believe it could be enough. That maybe I could finally breathe. But then, I saw her. Among the crowd near the edge of the gazebo stood a woman in a pale dress. She didn't belong to the party. She didn't hold a gift or a drink. She wasn't smiling. She was staring straight at me. And it was her. Eleanor. Alive. I couldn't breathe. The moment I saw her, standing near the gazebo, just beyond the pastel streamers and crystal champagne flutes, my entire world stopped. The sound of the baby shower dulled into a strange underwater hum. Laughter, music, even Sabrina's voice calling my name faded into nothingness. All I could hear was the frantic drumbeat of my own heart pounding in my ears. She was wearing a simple pale dress, the kind Eleanor would have chosen for a quiet Sunday brunch, not a spectacle like this. Her hair was tied loosely at the nape of her neck, and she wasn't wearing makeup, but I'd have known that face anywhere. The gentle curve of her jaw, the quiet storm behind her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly as they clutched her purse, and for a fleeting second, our gazes locked. It was her. Not a hallucination. Not a stranger. Not a ghost. Eleanor Langston, my wife, was alive. My legs moved before my mind caught up. I pushed past guests, knocked over a glass of sparkling cider, barely heard the murmur of startled voices behind me. Richard, what's going on?" Sabrina's voice trailed after me, sharp with confusion, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Eleanor's eyes widened as she realized I'd seen her. She took a half step back, And that was all it took to snap the spell. She turned, pivoted like a startled deer, and darted toward the hedges bordering the driveway. I chased her, my shoes sinking into the manicured lawn, breath burning in my chest. "Eleanor!" I shouted. "Wait, please!" But by the time I reached the edge of the property, she was gone. The valet station stood empty. The driveway stretched silent beneath a canopy of oak trees. Only a few distant cars dotted the lane. I spun around, searching, desperate. Nothing. Just the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. I collapsed against the trunk of a tree, chest heaving, my pulse erratic. My knees buckled, and I slid down the bark, hands buried in my hair. Was I going mad? Had grief twisted my mind so thoroughly that I was seeing what I most wanted to see? But no, that was not a dream. That was not my imagination. I had looked into my wife's eyes. She was real. The guests began to wander toward me, hesitant, murmuring amongst themselves. Sabrina was the first to reach me, her heels sinking into the earth, her breath shallow. "What happened?" she asked, crouching beside me, her voice laced with rising panic. "Why did you run like that? What did you see?" I couldn't answer. I couldn't say it. Not yet. Instead, I looked at her, really looked, and saw something that gutted me. Fear. Not just confusion, not worry about the scene I'd made. This was the raw terror of someone who knew something wasn't right, but couldn't yet name it. And maybe, deep down, feared she already knew. Back inside the estate, the baby shower sputtered to a close. Guests made awkward goodbyes, offering tight smiles and sidelong glances. Sabrina put on a brave face, tried to salvage the afternoon with humor, brushing off my behavior as pre-baby nerves. But beneath the gloss, she was unraveling. I could see it in the tremble of her hand as she cradled her belly, the flicker of her eyes scanning the lawn like she half expected someone to jump from the bushes. As soon as the last car rolled down the driveway, she cornered me in the study. "Richard," she said, shutting the door behind her. "What the hell is going on?" I stood by the window, watching the breeze stir the curtains. "I saw Eleanor," I said softly. Sabrina blinked. "What?" "I saw her. She was here, standing by the gazebo. She looked right at me, and then she ran." "Richard," her voice cracked. "You buried her. I watched you mourn her. That was 6 months ago." "I know what I saw," I snapped, spinning to face her. It was her. She wasn't a look-alike. She wasn't a trick of the light. It was Eleanor. For a long moment, Sabrina said nothing. Then she laughed, sharp, disbelieving, brittle. "You've been under stress. That's understandable. But this, you're seeing ghosts." I shook my head. No, I'm not." She stared at me, her eyes glistening. "So what does that mean? That she faked her death? That she's been alive this whole time while you grieved yourself into oblivion? She stopped herself, swallowing back emotion. "I don't know why," I said, "but I swear to you, she's alive." Her shoulders tensed, arms wrapped protectively around her belly. "What happens to us now, Richard? What happens to this child?" Her voice broke on the last word, and she turned away, disappearing down the hall without waiting for an answer. That night, I didn't sleep. I paced the halls of my home, retracing every step I had taken with Eleanor, trying to decipher her silence. What could possibly justify letting me think she was dead? What had driven her to disappear without a word? And why return now, here, of all places? Just before dawn, I stormed into the security room and demanded access to the surveillance footage from the baby shower. Neil hesitated, blinking the sleep from his eyes, but didn't argue. He pulled up the recordings and slid his chair aside. "Tell me what I'm looking for," he said. Eleanor, somewhere near the gazebo." We watched in silence as hours of footage sped by, in muted fast-forward. People mingled, caterers passed out flutes of champagne, musicians played under the canopy. Nothing. Then, just as I was beginning to doubt myself, it happened. She appeared on the edge of the frame. A woman in a pale dress stepped into view, pausing just for a moment near the flower beds. She turned her head slightly, enough for the camera to capture a partial profile. And though it wasn't crystal clear, it was enough. The curve of her cheek, the angle of her nose. That was Eleanor. I froze the frame and leaned in, heart pounding. "It's her," I whispered. Neil's eyes widened. "Jesus, are you sure? I'd know that face anywhere." I scrolled forward, searching for another angle, another glimpse, but she never showed up again. It was as if she had stepped into my life for one impossible moment, then vanished into thin air. A ghost in the garden. I didn't know what she was running from or toward, but I knew one thing with terrifying certainty. This wasn't over, and I would not rest until I found out the truth. I didn't go back to work the next morning. I couldn't. My body was in the house, but my mind was somewhere else, trapped in that single frozen frame of Eleanor's face, caught on a grainy security camera, like a haunting whisper from the past refusing to fade. I stared at the screen so long my eyes burned. I must have replayed those 2 seconds of footage 100 times, hoping for some hidden clue, some movement or shadow that would tell me where she'd gone next. But she was just gone. I called Gerald, my attorney and longtime friend, and told him everything. He arrived before noon, calm and composed in that old-school way of his, gray suit, notebook under his arm, silver-rimmed glasses low on his nose. He didn't laugh. He didn't doubt. He simply sat down, folded his hands, and asked, "Tell me everything," slowly. I showed him the footage, explained how I saw her at the baby shower, how she vanished, how the footage confirmed it wasn't in my head. Gerald rubbed his chin and nodded thoughtfully. "If she's alive," he said, "the first question isn't where is she? It's why hasn't she come back to you? That is what scares me." That same question had been gnawing at my soul since the moment I saw her. Why? Why would the woman who once swore she'd never leave me like this? That afternoon, Neil appeared in my study holding a printed email, brows furrowed. "Richard, there's something you need to see." The email was from a name I didn't recognize, Emily Voss, a freelance journalist working with a local Hudson Valley paper. She'd reached out to my public relations office days ago, asking to speak about the pileup that supposedly took Eleanor's life. Her subject line was simple: follow-up on the Hudson Parkway incident. Her message was direct, unnervingly specific. "I've been reviewing publicly available data on the crash. There are discrepancies in the coroner's report, details that don't add up. I'm not looking to publish anything yet, but I believe there's more to the story. If you're willing to speak with me off the record, I can show you what I've found." I read the email 3 times. My hands started to sweat. Gerald leaned over my shoulder, lips tight. "She sounds like she's either onto something or playing with fire." I replied immediately, asking for a discreet meeting. Emily suggested a small cafe an hour outside the city. Quiet, neutral, private. We agreed to meet the following day. I drove out alone. The cafe was nestled on a sleepy corner of a riverside town, the kind of place with hand-drawn chalkboard menus and clinking teacups. Emily was already seated in the back, a slim woman in her late 20s with curly brown hair tucked under a beanie and the kind of eyes that missed nothing. She looked nervous but determined. "Mr. Langston," she said, rising to shake my hand, "thank you for meeting me." "Call me Richard," I said. "You said you had information." She slid a manila folder across the table, her voice low. "I filed a public records request for the crash report, the coroner's notes, EMS logs, everything I could get, and I found something strange." She opened the folder and pointed to a highlighted paragraph. "According to the coroner's report, the remains pulled from your wife's car were severely burned. But the fire patterns suggest the body was in the rear passenger seat, not the driver's seat." I blinked. "That can't be right." "Eleanor was driving," Emily nodded. "Exactly. The authorities assumed it was her because they found her purse and phone in the front seat. But those items could have been placed there, or simply shifted during the crash." She handed me another paper. "This part here. EMS records say they only found one body in the wreckage of a vehicle that had 2 airbags deployed. That implies 2 occupants, but only one was recovered." I stared at the pages, a sick feeling rising in my gut. "You're saying Eleanor may have survived that crash?" "There's more," Emily said. "A man named Robert Delgado contacted the paper last month. He was in the second car behind your wife's. He said he saw a woman, brunette, pregnant, stumble out of the passenger side and walk into the woods before emergency crews arrived. But he was taken to the hospital for head trauma before he could report it. By the time he tried, the case was closed." I leaned back, trying to catch my breath. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Emily looked me in the eye. "Because if it were me, and my wife might still be alive, I'd want to know." I walked out of that cafe a different man. The sun had already dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows on the pavement, but I barely noticed. The world had tilted again, And this time I wasn't grieving, I was burning with purpose. I wasn't just chasing a ghost, I was chasing the truth. Eleanor hadn't just survived, she had run. That night, I shut myself in my study and pulled out every document I had from that horrible week. Funeral arrangements, emails from the hospital, the original coroner's notes. Gerald arrived later and helped me cross-reference every detail Emily had shared. And as we worked through the files, a horrifying realization settled over us both. The entire identification had been based on circumstantial evidence. Her purse, her phone, the car. But no DNA test had been done. No dental records confirmed. Just a rush to close the case. Jesus Christ, Gerald muttered. This wasn't confirmation. This was assumption. The next morning, I sent a private investigator to track down Robert Delgado. Within 2 days, he confirmed his story. Yes, he saw a woman matching Eleanor's description walking away from the wreck. No one ever followed up. It all clicked into place like the final pieces of a terrible puzzle. Eleanor had walked away from that crash. And for some reason, she didn't want to be found. That night, I didn't drink. I didn't pace. I made a vow. No more guesswork. No more sleepless nights haunted by footage and half-memories. I was going to find my wife, no matter what it took, because if she was alive, she had a reason. And God help anyone who stood in the way of me learning it. I followed every thread I could find, every piece of paper, every footnote in the crash report, every name attached to the emergency response logs. I chased them all like a bloodhound starved for truth. But the closer I got, the more the trail twisted, evaporated, or doubled back into fog. Eleanor had vanished as if the earth itself had swallowed her. Until I met the nurse. Her name was Nina Wallace. She worked night shifts at a small, private hospital on the outskirts of the city. The kind of place you don't find unless you know exactly where to look. She was older than I expected, maybe in her early 50s, with kind eyes and worry lines that cut deep across her forehead. I'd gotten her name through the investigator I hired. He said she was flagged in an old hospital record under an anonymous emergency intake case, logged on the same night as the crash. Pregnant female, disoriented, no ID. I waited for her in the parking lot, exactly where she asked me to meet. She arrived wearing a navy raincoat, looking around as if she was expecting to be followed. "You're Richard Langston?" she asked in a hushed tone. "I am. Thank you for meeting me. I need to ask you about a woman you treated." "I know who you're here about," she cut in. "I knew someday someone would come." She looked over her shoulder, then stepped closer. "She said her name was Anna," Nina began, "but I knew it wasn't her real name. You don't forget a face like that, especially one splashed across the news days later. I recognized her the moment I saw her on TV. Eleanor Langston, pregnant, missing, presumed dead." My stomach clenched. "Why didn't you come forward?" She begged me not to, pleaded. Nina's eyes glistened. She wasn't injured badly, shaken up, bruised, but nothing life-threatening. But her fear, it was bone deep. She kept whispering, "No one can know I'm alive. It's too dangerous." Over and over. Dangerous? What was she afraid of? I asked. She never said names. Just something about powerful people. She was carrying something, I think. Something that could ruin someone. She said if they knew she was alive, they'd come after her again. I asked her what she meant, but she just stared at the wall and said, "If they think I'm dead, Richard's safe." My chest tightened at the mention of my name. She knew she was carrying your child. She kept holding her belly. I could tell that child was her entire world, Nina added, her voice softening. She stayed for one night. Then, she was gone, just vanished. She left without being discharged. No ID, no contact number, just disappeared. I stared at the ground. The pieces colliding in my mind like a violent storm. Eleanor hadn't been running from me. She had been running for me, protecting me, shielding our unborn child from something I still couldn't see. Nina pulled a small object from her pocket. A rusted hospital locker key, dangling from a thin, frayed ribbon. "She left this with me," she said. "Told me to give it to you, if you ever came looking." She said it was all the proof anyone would need. My fingers closed around the key like it was the last piece of her I'd ever hold. It was warm from her touch, real. "Locker 142, Nina whispered. "Basement level, east wing." I thanked her. I tried to offer her money, protection, a way out if she felt unsafe, but she just shook her head. I kept quiet all this time because I thought I was helping her. But keeping secrets, it's heavy, Mr. Langston. I hope you find her. I really do. That same night, I drove straight to the hospital. It was after midnight, but I didn't care. I moved through the dim halls like a man possessed, tracing the sterile corridors until I found the basement wing. Locker 142 sat at the far end, barely lit by a flickering fluorescent bulb. I slipped in the key, hands trembling. Inside was a single brown envelope. I pulled it out, breath held, and opened it slowly. Inside were a handful of photographs, a USB flash drive, and a note in handwriting I knew better than my own. Richard, if you found this, then I know you haven't stopped searching for me. I hoped you would, and feared you might. I wish I could tell you this in person, but that would mean putting you in danger again. The night of the crash, I saw something I wasn't supposed to, something vile. I had been helping a friend investigate irregularities tied to one of your competitors, Derek Blackwell. It started with charity finances, but it led to something darker. Arms deals, money laundering, threats. I had documents, I made copies, I wasn't supposed to have them, and somehow they found out. I think the crash was staged to silence me, or scare me. Either way, I couldn't risk staying. I couldn't risk them using you to get to me. So I ran. I know what I did hurt you. I'm so sorry. I wanted to come back 1,000 times, but our baby, our son, he had to be safe. I had to stay dead. When the time is right, I will find you again. But until then, trust no one. Not even the people closest to you. Watch for shadows where there should be light. And please, protect yourself. With everything I have left in me. Eleanor, I didn't realize I was crying until the tears smeared the ink. The photos showed men in dark suits, some of whom I recognized, investors, board members, people I'd shaken hands with at events. One photo sent a chill through my spine. Derek Blackwell himself, seated beside a man I knew personally. Someone who'd once been part of my inner circle. The USB drive, when I plugged it into my private laptop later that night, was packed with files, emails, transaction records, voice recordings. The evidence was damning, enough to bring down empires. Enough to make someone very, very desperate to silence the one person who could expose them. Eleanor hadn't just disappeared. She had sacrificed everything to keep me and our child alive. I sat in the dark for hours, us clutching the envelope, listening to the recordings over and over. My hands were shaking, my mind a whirlwind of disbelief, anger, heartbreak, and awe. She had done all this alone, carried this weight, and not once had she broken. But the moment that broke me came quietly, when I found a photo tucked at the back of the envelope. It wasn't part of the evidence, it was just a small Polaroid, creased at the edges, Eleanor in a plain sweater smiling softly. And in her arms, a newborn baby wrapped in a pale blue blanket, our son, alive. Somewhere out there, my wife was raising him in secret, hiding him from the world, from enemies I didn't even know I had. And I wasn't going to rest until I brought them both home. The rain began to fall in sheets just as I left the hospital. I didn't even notice at first. The storm soaked through my jacket, plastered my hair to my forehead, but I kept walking, down the empty sidewalk, across the parking lot, past flickering street lamps that barely lit the night. The world around me had shifted. What I just discovered inside that rusted locker didn't just change my understanding of the past 6 months. It rewrote everything I thought I knew about love, sacrifice, and survival. Eleanor had given birth to our son, and she was still protecting him and me. I should have gone home. I should have gone to Sabrina, who was likely pacing the living room floor wondering why I hadn't answered her calls. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed a moment longer in the silence of that rain, letting the weight of Eleanor's words settle into my bones. When I finally got back to the estate, the sky had turned a murky gray, and the air inside the house felt tense. Too still, like the quiet before a storm. Sabrina was sitting on the couch, one hand resting protectively over her belly, the other clutching her phone. Her eyes locked onto mine the moment I stepped through the door, and I knew she'd sensed something had shifted. "Where have you been?" she asked quietly. "I needed to clear my head," I replied, peeling off my drenched coat. She didn't buy it. I could see it in the way her brow furrowed, in the tightness around her mouth. She stood slowly, one hand braced against her back, the other still cradling her stomach. "You saw her again, didn't you?" I froze. "What?" "Eleanor," she said. You've been different ever since the baby shower. Your eyes won't stop searching corners. You barely sleep. You're here, but not really. You're chasing her, Richard." I looked away. "I'm chasing the truth." She stepped closer, her voice trembling now. "And what about me? What about our baby?" I took a breath, but before I could speak, her face crumpled. She turned, pacing in short, angry strides. "I stood by you. I picked you up when you were a wreck. I held your hand through the worst months of your life. And now you're acting like she's the only one who matters. That's not true." She stopped and turned, her voice sharp. "Then tell me it's over. Tell me you're done chasing a ghost and that you're here, with me." I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But I couldn't lie to her. "I saw her, Sabrina," I said finally. "I've seen the proof. She didn't crash. She survived, and she ran because she was afraid. Not of me, not of us, of something bigger." Sabrina's mouth fell open. "You're serious," I nodded. "She left behind evidence. She uncovered something. Illegal deals, dangerous men, people who would have killed her to silence her. She faked her death to protect me, and our son." Her eyes widened. "Your son?" I nodded slowly. "She gave birth somewhere safe. He's alive." Sabrina took a step back, her face pale. "So everything we've built, everything we've tried to make, what does it mean now?" "It still matters," I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "You and this baby, we're a family. I won't walk away from that, I swear to you." "But you still love her," she whispered. I didn't answer. She didn't need me to. That night she moved into one of the guest rooms. We barely spoke. The house felt like it was splintering from the inside. Fragile walls, strained air. I spent hours alone in the study, combing through the files Eleanor had left, trying to piece together a clearer picture of the conspiracy she'd unearthed. Names, dates, accounts, shell companies. It was all there. And Derek Blackwell was at the center of it. He had everything to lose if this came out. The deeper I dug, the more obvious it became. Eleanor hadn't just gone into hiding. She was running for her life. And for mine. 3 days later, Sabrina went into early labor. I was in the middle of a phone call with Gerald, planning our next move with the evidence, when Neil burst into the study, face white. "It's Sabrina," he said. "Her water broke. She's bleeding." The next few hours were a blur of flashing ambulance lights, rushing doctors, and the antiseptic sting of hospital air. I stayed by her side as long as they let me, holding her hand, whispering comfort I wasn't sure she could hear. She was pale, sweating, crying out in pain. And when our daughter arrived, tiny, wailing, a perfect cry, I felt something inside me crack open. This child, she was hope made flesh, a fragile light in the middle of chaos. But Sabrina didn't wake. Her blood pressure spiked. Monitors screamed. Doctors shouted. I was shoved out into the hallway as a team swarmed the room. I stood there, helpless, soaked in fear. Gerald arrived, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said nothing. He didn't need to. Time slowed again. Eventually, a doctor emerged, her face tight with exhaustion. "She's alive," she said, "but she's in critical condition. She'll be moved to the ICU." I thanked her through a voice I could barely find, then followed the nurse to see my daughter. She was in the NICU, swaddled in pink, her chest rising and falling in tiny, determined breaths. I touched her cheek with the tip of my finger. "Hello, sweetheart," I whispered. "Your big brother's out there somewhere. And your mother. Your other mother. She's a warrior. Just like you." And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't about choosing between two women anymore. This wasn't about guilt, or duty, or even love. This was about truth, about protecting the two children who now carried pieces of my soul. About taking down the men who had tried to steal everything from us. Later that night, I received a call. Gerald had finished going through the rest of the flash drive. "It's bigger than we thought," he said, voice tight. "Money laundering, international accounts, shell corporations, and worse. Arms shipments, covert contracts. These aren't just business criminals. These are men who think they're untouchable." "Not anymore," I replied. Then, just as I was about to hang up, I noticed someone standing at the end of the hallway. A figure in a long coat, hair tied in a loose bun. My heart stopped. "Gerald," I whispered. "She's here." I let the phone fall to the floor as I stepped forward. And there she was. Eleanor. Real. Breathing. Tears glistening in her eyes. She didn't speak at first. She just walked toward me. One hand trembling, the other pressed against her heart. When we finally met in the middle of that sterile hallway, I pulled her into my arms and held her like I never had before. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I came back because I knew you were getting close. I had to warn you, it's not over. They'll come after you now, too." I looked down at her, barely breathing. "Where's our son?" "He's safe," she said, eyes shining. "With someone I trust, waiting for my word." And with that, everything I thought I'd lost began to come back into view. Eleanor's return wasn't the end of the storm. It was only the beginning. In the days that followed, our lives were thrown into a blur of whispered meetings, encrypted files, and late-night strategy sessions that unfolded behind closed doors. The woman I held in my arms at the hospital was no longer just my wife. She was a survivor, a whistleblower, and the only key to a scandal that could bring down men who had built empires on blood and secrets. And I was her shield now. Gerald, ever the tactician, set the plan into motion. The evidence Eleanor had collected was overwhelming, but it had to be handled carefully. One leak to the wrong hands, one whisper out of place, and not only would she be targeted again, so would our children. So would Sabrina. We needed a controlled release. The authorities had to be brought in, quietly and strategically. We arranged a secure meeting with federal agents known to Gerald, seasoned investigators from a specialized economic crimes task force. The moment they reviewed the contents of the USB drive, their expressions darkened. Phone calls were made, protective orders were filed. Surveillance on our estate doubled overnight. Frederick Blackwell's name alone was enough to cause a stir, but when cross-referenced with the bank records, offshore transfers, and illegal arms shipments Eleanor had uncovered, it set off alarms from DC to Geneva. "He's more than a corrupt businessman," one of the agents told us. "He's part of something deeper. And if your wife hadn't disappeared when she did, she wouldn't be standing here." Those words haunted me. I watched Eleanor in those days with a mix of awe and heartache. She wasn't the same woman I remembered from quiet mornings and charity galas. The softness was still there, in her voice when she spoke of our son, in her smile when she caught a glimpse of our daughter through the NICU window. But she carried herself differently now. Stronger, harder. Like someone who had lived every second with danger breathing down her neck. We spoke in hushed tones, mostly in the dead of night, while the world slept and our daughter dreamed behind a sheet of plexiglass in the hospital ward. I asked her what it had been like. Those months on the run, giving birth alone, trusting no one. She didn't offer much. "Some stories aren't ready to be told," she said once, her voice distant, eyes fixed on the rain sliding down the window. "But I never stopped loving you. I never stopped wishing things could be different." "Where is he now?" I asked. "Our son?" She hesitated. "With a retired friend of mine, a woman I met while doing charity work years ago. She runs a safe house overseas. She's always known how to disappear. He's safe, but he misses me." I felt something twist in my chest. I had missed his entire beginning, his first breath, his first cry, his first smile. But if the price of his safety was my absence, then it was a price worth paying. Now I just wanted him home. Sabrina, meanwhile, had returned from the ICU, stable but frail. Her recovery was slow and difficult, compounded by the emotional earthquake that Eleanor's reappearance had triggered. I tried to be present, to comfort her, to remind her that she mattered because she did. She always would. But it was hard. One afternoon, when I came to check on her, I found her staring out the bedroom window, our newborn daughter sleeping beside her. "She looks like you," she whispered. I sat beside her. "She's strong like you." Sabrina glanced at me, eyes tired but clear. "Eleanor's alive, and she's the mother of your first child. I don't need you to explain it. I just need to know where I stand." I reached for her hand. "You're the mother of my daughter. You're my partner in this. That will never change." She nodded slowly. "But your heart, part of it still belongs to her." I didn't deny it. Instead, I said the only thing that felt true. "There's enough room for all of us, if we're brave enough." It was the closest thing to peace we could find in a moment like that. But the world outside our doors wasn't interested in peace. The arrests began quietly. A junior executive in Blackwell's firm was taken at dawn. Then a Swiss banker known for discreet accounts. Then a lobbyist whose name had been whispered at every major fundraiser in New York, each one linked by the evidence Eleanor had hidden away. But the higher we climbed, the closer we came to Blackwell himself. and the more dangerous things became. The media hadn't caught on yet, but the pressure was mounting. Anonymous threats began arriving by email, vague, chilling promises of silence or destruction. One night, a black SUV parked across the street from the estate for 6 hours without moving. When police arrived, it was gone. I hired private security. Gerald coordinated with federal marshals. Eleanor, for her part, remained calm. She refused to be intimidated. "I didn't survive all this just to live in fear," she said. "This ends when the truth comes out." We planned the reveal carefully. She would testify before a federal grand jury. Until then, she remained in protective custody, moved to a government safe house not far from the estate. We still saw each other, under escort, in stolen moments carved out between planning meetings and legal briefings. The day she left for the safe house, she stopped at the hospital to hold our daughter. I watched her through the glass, cradling that tiny life in her arms. Tears streaked her cheeks, and yet she smiled through them, whispering something I couldn't hear. When she emerged, I took her hand. "She has your eyes," she said, "and your strength." Eleanor laughed softly. "God help the world if she grows up anything like us." As the agents escorted her away, I stood frozen by the hospital doors, watching until the car disappeared into the traffic. Part of me wanted to run after her. Another part knew that the best thing I could do for her now was wait and be ready. The testimony was scheduled for the following week, and when she stepped into that courtroom, the whole world would finally learn what she'd sacrificed to protect the ones she loved, and who had tried to destroy her for it. The morning Eleanor was set to testify, I woke before dawn, heart pounding like a war drum in my chest. Outside my window, the world was still cloaked in shadows, the streets slick with last night's rain. The city was quiet, but I wasn't fooled. Beneath the silence, the whole machine was winding up, preparing for a reckoning. Eleanor was going to tell the world everything. The charges filed against Frederick Blackwell and his associates had already started to ripple through the financial world, like cracks in the foundation of a skyscraper. High-profile resignations, mysterious account closures, whispers of foreign governments watching closely. But today would be the earthquake. Once Eleanor stood in that courtroom and gave her statement under oath, there'd be no turning back. I watched the televised footage from the estate, pacing in front of the screen like a man possessed. I wasn't allowed in the courtroom. It was sealed for her protection. Only a handful of agents, lawyers, and the judge were present. She appeared on the screen in a navy blue blouse, simple pearl earrings, her hair swept back in a clean, professional bun. No makeup, no dramatics. Just Eleanor, my wife, the one I had buried, the one now rising from the ashes, not just for herself, but for all of us. She spoke with clarity and calm, outlining her discovery of Blackwell's shell companies, the hidden funds tied to illegal arms deals, the threats she'd received, the staged crash that had nearly killed her. She described the day she walked away from the burning wreck, cradling her unborn child and terrified out of her mind. She talked about the months in hiding, the help she'd received from strangers, and the night she gave birth in a safe house bathroom, alone, praying that someday, somehow, she'd make it back to me. And then she said my name. Richard Langston, she told the court, had no part in this, but they would have used him to break me. So I left. I let the world believe I was gone because I believed that was the only way to save him and our son. Hearing her say it aloud, in a room full of federal agents and legal officials, was like a blade to the heart, but it was also a release. All the questions, all the pain, all the sleepless nights, they finally had an answer. She hadn't run from me. She had run for me. That night, after the court session ended and headlines exploded across the internet, Millionaire's wife returns from the dead, exposes international scandal. I received a call from the marshals. Eleanor was safe. Her testimony had been recorded and sealed under federal protection. Blackwell had been indicted. Arrests were already underway. And then, the words I'd been waiting to hear, "She's coming home." We met again in the same hospital hallway where I had last seen her weeks before. But this time, the fear in her eyes was gone. Her shoulders were straighter, her steps steadier. She walked like a woman who had just taken down giants. I held her for a long time. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. When she pulled back, her hand slid into her coat pocket and came out holding something I hadn't dared dream of, An old, well-loved photograph of a little boy, maybe 5 months old, wrapped in a soft blue blanket, his dark eyes wide, his expression already serious like his mother's. "Our son," she whispered. I took the photo in trembling fingers. "What's his name?" "Caleb," I mouthed the name like a prayer. "Where is he?" I asked. "With Julia, the woman I told you about. She's ready to bring him to us. We just need to say when." "When?" I said immediately. Eleanor smiled through her tears. "He has your eyes, Richard, and your courage." We brought Caleb home 2 days later. Julia arrived at the estate in a quiet sedan, accompanied by a federal escort. When she stepped out of the car with our son in her arms, it was like time folded in on itself. I don't remember walking toward her, but suddenly I was there, my arms reaching out, my heart thudding so loud I could barely hear anything else. He looked up at me, this small, perfect miracle, and something in me cracked wide open. I wasn't just Richard Langston, the grieving widower, the businessman, the man who had stumbled through months of darkness. I was a father. I had a son, and I would never let him go. Eleanor watched us quietly from the steps of the house, her hand resting on the shoulder of our security guard. Sabrina stood behind her, holding our daughter in her arms. The two women didn't speak at first, but then, slowly, Sabrina stepped forward. "She's beautiful," Eleanor said softly. "So is he," Sabrina replied, her gaze fixed on Caleb. Then, after a beat, "Our kids are siblings. I guess that makes us something." Eleanor smiled, weary but genuine. "I never meant to destroy what you had." "I know," Sabrina said, "and I never meant to take your place." They both looked at me, then at the children. There was no roadmap for what came next. No easy way to blend heartbreak and healing into something functional. But somehow, standing there on the porch, with our children between us and the weight of the past finally beginning to lift, I believed we could figure it out. In the weeks that followed, the estate transformed. The nursery became a shared haven, one crib for our daughter, another for Caleb. I'd walk past in the early mornings and hear Eleanor singing softly, Sabrina talking gently to them both. The walls, once echoing with silence and regret, now buzzed with laughter, soft lullabies, the rustle of tiny blankets. Outside, the world still roared. The news coverage didn't stop. Blackwell and his inner circle were the scandal of the year. Analysts speculated endlessly, talk shows dissected Eleanor's every word. But inside these walls, none of it mattered. What mattered was holding Eleanor's hand when the nightmares came. Sitting beside Sabrina as she learned to breastfeed again after surgery. Telling bedtime stories to a child who couldn't yet understand the words, but seemed to recognize the sound of his father's voice. I lived two lives now, one as the man who helped bring down a criminal empire, the other as a father trying to fix what had been broken. One night, I found Eleanor sitting on the back porch alone, her robe drawn tight around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Do you regret coming back?" I asked her gently. She looked at me, tears shining but not falling. Not for a second. I sat beside her. We watched the stars in silence for a while. Then she leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "What happens now?" I thought about it. About court dates and therapy sessions, about shared custody and awkward holiday dinners, about learning how to love again, this time in full truth. "I think," I said, "we just keep going. One day at a time." She nodded. "I can do that," so we did. Because in the end, life isn't about the fairy tale. It's about what happens after the story breaks apart. It's about the pieces we gather, the wounds we stitch, the family we fight to keep, no matter how complicated, no matter how imperfect. And in that imperfection, we found something real, something worth fighting for. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this powerful story. If you're still here, it means you felt something, and that means everything to us. This story wasn't just about a man chasing the shadow of a lost love. It was about resilience, about sacrifice, about the quiet, unbreakable strength it takes to protect those you love, even when the world misunderstands you. We were reminded that sometimes the people we think are gone are still fighting for us in silence, and that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to rise. In a world full of noise and distraction, stories like this remind us what truly matters: love, family, redemption, and the courage to start over. Now we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that stir the soul. We have more powerful tales coming your way that you won't want to miss. Until next time, take care of yourself and those you love.